You should know what happened this 1828 and why it is the most important event in history. The mysterious disappearance of William Morgan, how one man's secret exposé ignited America's first third political party and shook Freemasonry to its core. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Imagine, if you will, a crisp autumn evening in the small village of Batavia, New York, in the year 1826. The Erie Canal was still fresh in people's minds, carving its way through the wilderness and bringing with it dreams of prosperity, progress, and a new American identity. But beneath the surface of this bustling young republic, something darker was stirring. A secret society, powerful and ancient, had embedded itself deep into the fabric of politics, business, and local governance. Freemasonry, with its mysterious rituals, handshakes, and oaths of secrecy, was not just a fraternal club, it was an invisible empire. And in that quiet corner of western New York, one ordinary man, a bricklayer and stonemason named William Morgan, was about to tear that empire apart with nothing more than a pen and a promise. To understand why the events that unfolded in 1826 would explode into a national firestorm by 1828, we must first step back and meet the man at the center of it all. William Morgan was born around 1774 in Culpeper County, Virginia, into a world still shaking off the dust of the Revolutionary War. He grew up hearing tales of liberty and independence, of men who had fought against tyranny and secret alliances. As a young adult, he served in the War of 1812, that often overlooked conflict where Americans once again proved their mettle against the British. Morgan wasn't a hero in the grand sense. No statues would ever be erected for him, but he was a survivor. He drifted northward after the war, trying his hand at various trades, eventually settling in the frontier town of Batavia as a bricklayer and stonemason. Life in Batavia was rough and tumble. The village was growing fast thanks to the canal boom, but it was still a place where reputations were everything and grudges could last a lifetime. Morgan was described by those who knew him as outgoing, sociable, and a bit of a drifter at heart. He had a wife, Lucinda, whom he married in 1819, and 2 children. But money was always tight, and Morgan had a reputation for being something of a drinker and a talker, qualities that would both help and hinder him in the years to come. What mattered most, though, was his involvement with the local Masonic lodge. Morgan had been initiated into Freemasonry years earlier, rising through some of the degrees in Virginia and later in New York. He knew the rituals, the secret words, the grips, the dramatic oaths sworn on the Bible under dim candlelight. To many, Masonry was a path to respectability, a network that could open doors in business and politics. Presidents like George Washington and Andrew Jackson had been Masons. Judges, sheriffs, and merchants filled the lodges. It was the ultimate old boys club in a nation that prided itself on equality. But by the mid-1820s, something had soured for William Morgan. Perhaps it was the way local Masons seemed to control jobs, contracts, and court decisions in Batavia. Perhaps it was personal slights. He had been passed over for higher degrees or felt excluded from the inner circle. Contemporary accounts paint him as disillusioned, even bitter. He began to see Freemasonry not as a brotherhood of enlightenment, but as a secretive cabal that placed loyalty to the lodge above loyalty to the Republic. And in a young democracy still wary of kings, aristocrats, and hidden powers, that was dangerous talk. Morgan decided to do the unthinkable. He would expose it all. Enter David C. Miller, a local newspaper publisher and fellow resident of Batavia. Miller ran the Batavia Advocate, a small but fiery paper that wasn't afraid to stir the pot. Morgan approached him with an audacious plan. He would write a book titled Illustrations of Masonry, revealing in painstaking detail the secret ceremonies, passwords, signs, and oaths of the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, and even hinting at higher ones. Morgan wasn't inventing anything. He was simply lifting the veil on what thousands of men already knew but had sworn never to repeat. The book would include diagrams, explanations of the dramatic rituals involving blindfolds, nooses, and solemn vows of death for betrayal. It was explosive stuff in an era when secrecy bred suspicion. Word of Morgan's intentions spread like wildfire through the Masonic lodges of Western New York. At first, the brothers tried persuasion. They offered him money to abandon the project, hundreds of dollars, a small fortune then. When that failed, the harassment began. Morgan's character was attacked in whispers and public rumors. He was called a drunkard, a liar, a man of no honor. His printing arrangements with Miller were sabotaged. Threats turned darker, anonymous notes, late-night visits, warnings that something bad would happen if he didn't stop. But Morgan was stubborn. He had signed a contract with Miller, and the first pages were already being set in type. He believed in his cause, or at least in the profit and notoriety it might bring. Little did he know that his decision would cost him everything. As summer turned to fall in 1826, tensions reached a boiling point. On August 25, a group of Masons from Batavia Lodge number 433 met in secret. Among them were respected citizens, a sheriff, a judge, merchants, and farmers. They weren't radicals, they were pillars of the community, but they saw Morgan's book as a betrayal of the most sacred oaths. One participant later recalled the room thick with cigar smoke and righteous anger. Plans were hatched not to kill, they would claim, but to silence him through legal means or intimidation. A warrant was drawn up on trumped-up charges. Morgan, they said, had stolen a shirt and cravat from a tavern owner in Canandaigua, a town about 50 miles east. It was a petty larceny accusation, flimsy at best, but enough to get him behind bars. On the evening of September 11, 1826, the trap was sprung. Morgan was walking home from a local tavern when several men confronted him. They included Nicholas Chesebro, the master of the local lodge, and others like Lawton Lawson and Edward Sawyer. They flashed a warrant and dragged him away, not to the Batavia jail, but straight into a carriage bound for Canandaigua. Morgan protested loudly, shouting for help as neighbors watched in confusion. Help, murder. Some accounts say he cried, but the men assured bystanders it was just a legal matter. By midnight, Morgan was locked in the Canandaigua jail, alone and bewildered. His wife Lucinda, back in Batavia, had no idea where he was. What happened next is where the story turns from harassment to outright conspiracy. The next morning, September 12, Morgan was brought before a justice of the peace. The charges were dismissed almost immediately. The alleged victim couldn't even identify the stolen items properly. Morgan should have walked free, but as he stepped out of the courtroom, a new group of men was waiting. These weren't locals from Batavia. They were Masons from farther afield, coordinated through the invisible network of lodges. Among them was a man named John Whitney and others whose names would later surface in trials. They seized Morgan again, this time with a fresh warrant for an old debt, another pretext. Morgan was bundled into a closed carriage, his cries muffled. Witnesses later described hearing him yell, "I am being murdered," as the vehicle sped westward into the night. The journey that followed was a nightmare of secrecy and terror. Morgan was driven through the darkness along rough roads paralleling the Erie Canal. The men stopped at taverns where sympathetic Masons provided fresh horses and alibis. At one point they crossed into Rochester territory, then pushed onward toward the Niagara frontier. Morgan was bound, gagged at times, and guarded constantly. He begged for his life, promising to abandon the book, to leave the state, to never speak again. But the men had their orders, or so they believed. Their destination, Fort Niagara, an old military outpost at the mouth of the Niagara River, where Lake Ontario meets the Roaring Falls. The fort was largely abandoned, its stone walls a perfect place for a secret holding cell. By the early morning hours of September 13, Morgan was inside the fort's powder magazine, a dank underground room with thick walls that swallowed sound. Guards rotated in shifts. For several days he remained there, fed meager rations, interrogated, and pressured to reveal every detail of his manuscript. What exactly happened in those final hours remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Some accounts, pieced together from later confessions and rumors within Masonic circles, say Morgan was offered one last chance, swear never to publish, and be released in Canada. Others claim a more sinister end. On or around September 14 or 15, the guards reportedly took him by boat out onto the dark waters of Lake Ontario or the Niagara River. A heavy weight, perhaps a cannonball or stone, was tied to his body. A a splash in the night, and William Morgan vanished forever. No body was ever recovered, no grave marked his passing. He was simply gone. Back in Batavia, panic set in almost immediately. Lucinda Morgan raised the alarm on September 13 when her husband didn't return. David Miller, the publisher, suspected foul play right away. He printed urgent notices in his paper. William Morgan has been kidnapped by Freemasons. Word spread like wildfire along the canal towns. Neighbors formed search parties. Rewards were offered, hundreds of dollars for information, but the Masons closed ranks. When questioned, lodge members denied everything. Morgan ran off with another woman, some sneered. "He's in Canada laughing at us all." The local sheriff, himself a Mason, dragged his feet on the investigation. By late September 1826, the rumors had hardened into accusations. A grand jury was convened in Genesee County. Witnesses came forward, carriage drivers who recognized the men, tavern keepers who had seen the group pass through, even a few Masons who had cold feet and whispered details. Names like Chesebro, Sawyer, Lawson, and Whitney began to circulate. Arrest warrants were issued. The first trials started in 1827, but they were a farce. Juries packed with Masons acquitted the accused on technicalities. When convictions finally came for kidnapping, not murder since there was no body, they were laughably light, sentences of just 1 to 3 years in prison for a handful of men. The public was outraged. Newspapers across New York and New England picked up the story. "Masonry is a murder machine," screamed headlines. Preachers thundered from pulpits that the lodges were dens of Satan. Ordinary citizens boycotted Masonic businesses. Lodges saw their membership plummet as men resigned in droves, tearing up their aprons and burning their regalia in public bonfires. This was no longer just about one missing bricklayer. It was about power, secrecy, and whether a hidden order could operate above the law in the land of the free. By early 1828, the outrage had crystallized into something unprecedented in American politics, the birth of the Anti-Masonic Party. In villages and cities from Vermont to Pennsylvania, conventions were held. Thurlow Weed, a brilliant young editor and political operator, harnessed the fury. He turned the Morgan affair into a rallying cry against Andrew Jackson, the Democratic presidential candidate and a proud Mason. "No man above the law" became the slogan. The party nominated candidates for local offices and swept elections in New York. It was America's first true third party, the first to hold a national convention, the first to publish a platform of principles. For a brief, shining moment, it threatened to upend the two-party system entirely. But why, you might ask, does this single disappearance in 1826 deserve to be called the most important event leading into 1828? Because it wasn't just a crime, it was a mirror held up to the young republic. America was barely 50 years old, still defining what democracy meant. Freemasonry represented the old world, elite networks, blood oaths, rituals that echoed medieval guilds and European aristocracy. Morgan's fate exposed the tension between brotherhood and betrayal, between secrecy and transparency. His story forced a national conversation. Can a free society tolerate secret societies that swear allegiance first to each other? The anti-Masonic movement didn't just elect officials, it changed how Americans viewed power. It paved the way for future reform parties, for greater scrutiny of elites, and even influenced the rise of the Whig Party that followed. Without Morgan, there might never have been that first crack in the two-party monopoly. As the trials dragged on and the political storm gathered, one question haunted everyone: what really happened to William Morgan on those dark waters? Was he drowned like a dog, his body sinking into the icy depths of Lake Ontario? Did he escape somehow and live out his days in hiding in Canada or the West? Or was the whole thing a Masonic ruse with Morgan paid off to disappear? Decades later, in the 1840s, a body washed ashore near the Niagara, and some claimed it was his. Lucinda herself identified it, but doubts lingered. A monument was even erected in Batavia Cemetery, sacred to the memory of William Morgan, a native of Virginia, a captain in the War of 1812 who was abducted from Batavia by Freemasons and murdered for revealing their secrets. It stands there still, a silent witness to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The men who orchestrated his abduction thought they were protecting an ancient tradition. Instead, they lit a fuse that would burn through the heart of American politics. By 1828, the Anti-Masonic Party was fielding candidates for governor, for Congress, even eyeing the White House. John Quincy Adams, no friend of Jackson, publicly denounced Masonry. Thousands of lodges across the North shut their doors forever. The movement spread westward and southward, though it never took root as strongly in the slaveholding states where Jackson's Democrats held sway. And yet, for all its passion, the party would fade by the 1830s, its energy absorbed into larger causes like abolition and economic reform. But its legacy endures in every third-party challenge, every demand for transparency in government, every suspicion of secret influence. As we sit here reflecting on this tale, picture the scene again. A lone man in a carriage racing through the night, his future stolen by shadows. William Morgan was no saint. He was flawed, opportunistic, perhaps even reckless. But in his defiance, he became a martyr for openness in a land that claimed to cherish it. The disappearance that began in 1826 didn't just vanish with him. It echoed across the decades, reshaping elections, exposing hypocrisies, and reminding us that one voice, one book, one act of courage can topple empires built on silence. The full fury of the public awakening was only just beginning. In the months after Morgan's abduction, as witnesses stepped forward and the first arrests were made, something extraordinary happened. Ordinary farmers, merchants, and mothers who had never cared about politics suddenly found their voices. They packed town halls, signed petitions, and demanded justice. But the real turning point, the moment when a local kidnapping became a national scandal, came when the trials exposed the breathtaking reach of Masonic influence in the courts themselves. Juries tainted, judges recusing or refusing, sheriffs looking the other way. It was as if the entire system was rigged from within. And that's where the story takes its most dramatic twist yet. The courtroom in Canandaigua became the unlikely stage for a drama that would expose the hidden machinery of power in ways no one could have predicted. It was January 1827 when the first of the accused Masons finally stood trial for the kidnapping of William Morgan. The defendant was Nicholas Chesebro, the very master of Batavia Lodge who had signed the original warrant. He sat there in his fine coat, surrounded by lawyers who were themselves Masons, while the gallery overflowed with angry citizens who had traveled miles through snow and mud just to witness justice. The prosecutor, a young attorney named John C. Spencer, whose own father had once been a high-ranking Mason, laid out the evidence with cold precision. Carriage drivers who swore they recognized Chesebro and his companions, tavern keepers who remembered the group stopping for fresh horses at midnight, even the jailer in Canandaigua who admitted under oath that Morgan had been taken away again the moment the petty larceny charge was dismissed. But the defense fought back with every trick in the book. Witnesses suddenly developed convenient memory loss. Documents disappeared. One juror after another was revealed to have taken Masonic oaths. When the jury retired, it took them less than an hour to return a verdict, guilty of conspiracy to kidnap, but only on the flimsiest technicality. Chesebro received a sentence of 1 year in prison, barely a slap on the wrist. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted in fury. Men shouted Masonic murder, while women waved black mourning ribbons for the missing bricklayer. That single verdict was like pouring gasoline on dry leaves. Within weeks, similar trials began across western New York. Lawton Lawson, Edward Sawyer, John Whitney, and a dozen others dragged into court on charges ranging from false imprisonment to accessory after the fact. Each proceeding followed the same sickening pattern: packed juries, intimidated witnesses, judges who mysteriously recused themselves at the last minute. In one particularly brazen case, the sheriff of Niagara County, a Mason in good standing, simply refused to serve warrants on his lodge brothers. The public would not be silenced. In Batavia, a citizens' committee formed under the leadership of David Miller, the publisher who had risked everything to print Morgan's unfinished manuscript. They hired private detectives, offered rewards that climbed as high as $5,000, and published every scrap of testimony in special editions that flew off the presses. Lucinda Morgan, now a widow in all but name with two small children to feed, became the living symbol of the injustice. She traveled from village to village, dressed in black, telling crowds how her husband had been torn from their home on that September night. "He was no saint," she would say with heartbreaking honesty, "but he was mine, and they took him because he dared to speak." Her quiet dignity did more to fuel the movement than any fiery speech. Men who had never voted before now swore they would never rest until the truth was known. By the spring of 1827, the scandal had leaped far beyond New York. Newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and even as far south as Charleston reprinted the trial transcripts. In Vermont and Pennsylvania, Masonic lodges began to empty overnight. Members publicly burned their aprons and certificates in town squares while crowds cheered. Preachers who had once praised the fraternity as a moral force now denounced it from the pulpit as the whore of Babylon. One minister in Rochester declared that every lodge was a court of inquisition more terrible than the Spanish one. Farmers refused to sell grain to Masonic merchants. Wives told their husbands they would leave if they did not resign. The economic pressure was devastating. Lodges that had once boasted hundreds of members now struggled to pay rent. In some towns, the local Masonic hall stood dark and silent, its windows boarded up against vandals. Yet even as the hatred grew, a few brave voices inside the fraternity began to break ranks. A Rochester Mason named Henry Brown published a letter admitting he had helped transport Morgan across the county line. Another, a judge named Elisha Adams, confessed in open court that he had been ordered by higher Masonic authorities to obstruct the investigation. These confessions were dynamite. They proved what many had suspected. This was not the work of a few hotheads in Batavia. It was a coordinated effort that reached into the highest levels of the New York Grand Lodge. Rumors swirled that even DeWitt Clinton, the governor and a prominent Mason, had quietly intervened to protect the guilty. Clinton denied it, but the damage was done. Trust in every institution, courts, government, even the churches began to erode. It was in this atmosphere of white-hot anger that something entirely new was born: organized political resistance. In the little town of Phelps, New York, in February 1828, a group of 26 men gathered in a schoolhouse and declared themselves the Anti-Masonic Party. They were not radicals or dreamers. They were blacksmiths, storekeepers, canal boat captains, ordinary Americans who had never before dreamed of challenging the great democratic machine of Andrew Jackson. Their platform was simple yet revolutionary. No man who swore secret oaths could hold public office. Every citizen had the right to know who truly pulled the strings of power, and justice must be blind, not hooded by a Masonic blindfold. Within months, similar conventions sprang up in dozens of counties. Thurlow Weed, the brilliant young editor from Rochester whose newspaper had chronicled every twist of the Morgan affair, saw the potential immediately. He threw the full weight of his pen behind the new party, writing scorching editorials that were read aloud in taverns and copied by hand in frontier cabins. By midsummer 1828, the movement had momentum no one could stop. Anti-Masonic candidates swept local elections in western New York. In Vermont, the party captured the governorship. Even in Pennsylvania, long considered a Masonic stronghold, thousands of voters crossed party lines. The national press took notice. The New York Evening Post, no friend of the movement, warned that a monster has been awakened that may devour the republic. But the monster, as its supporters saw it, was simply demanding the republic live up to its promises. Men who had once toasted George Washington as the greatest Mason now toasted William Morgan as the greatest patriot. Songs were written, pamphlets printed by the tens of thousands. One popular ballad, sung around campfires along the Erie Canal, told of the man who vanished in the night because he dared to bring the light. As the first frost touched the fields in the autumn of 1828, the Anti-Masonic Party stood poised on the edge of national prominence. Delegates from 13 states prepared to meet in Philadelphia for what would become the first national political convention in American history. They carried with them resolutions, petitions signed by thousands, and a burning determination to place their candidate on the ballot for president himself. The old parties, Jackson's Democrats and the fading National Republicans, watched with growing alarm. Jackson himself, a proud Mason who wore his apron with pride, dismissed the whole affair as the ravings of madmen. But privately, his advisors worried. The Morgan case had become a dagger aimed straight at the heart of the Democratic machine. The stage was now set for the most explosive year in early American political history. Yet even as the conventions assembled and the speeches rang out, a new and terrible rumor began to circulate. Whispers that William Morgan had not been murdered at all, that he had been seen alive in Canada or perhaps in the distant territories of the West. Was it possible the entire nation had been deceived, or was this simply the final, desperate lie of a guilty brotherhood? The answer, if it existed, would shake the young republic to its foundations once more. And that's where the story takes its most dramatic twist yet. The whispers about William Morgan still being alive did not begin as idle gossip. They arrived like thunderclaps in letters, affidavits, and sworn statements that landed on newspaper desks across the Northeast in the closing months of 1828 and the opening ones of 1829. One of the first and most explosive came from a man named James A. Rawson, a former resident of Lewiston, New York, who claimed under oath before a justice of the peace that in late September 1826, barely 2 weeks after Morgan's disappearance, he had seen the missing man alive and well on the Canadian side of the Niagara River. Rawson described Morgan as pale and agitated, walking with 2 men who appeared to be guarding him near the village of Queenston. According to Rawson, Morgan recognized him from Batavia days and mouthed the words "help me" before being hurried away into the woods. Rawson swore he had kept silent out of fear, but could no longer bear the weight of the secret now that so many innocent men faced ruin over the supposed murder. This affidavit was printed in full in Thurlow Weed's Rochester Telegraph and reprinted by sympathetic papers from Albany to Boston. Within days, counter-claims flooded in. A tavern keeper in Youngstown swore he had served Morgan a meal in October 1826, after which the bricklayer crossed into Upper Canada with a heavy purse and a new suit of clothes, clearly the payoff for his silence. Another witness, a canal boat captain, insisted he had ferried Morgan westward along Lake Erie under cover of darkness, destination unknown. Each story contradicted the last in small but maddening details. Morgan clean-shaven or bearded, wearing his old work clothes or dressed as a gentleman, speaking freely or gagged and bound. Yet every account agreed on one point: he was breathing. The Anti-Masonic conventions seized on these sightings like drowning men grasping at driftwood. Here was proof, they cried, that the entire Masonic Brotherhood had perpetrated the greatest hoax in American history, staging a fake abduction, faking a murder, and then using the resulting outrage to discredit their critics while Morgan lived comfortably on Masonic gold somewhere beyond the border. They murdered his reputation, not his body, thundered one speaker at a mass meeting in Utica. Pamphlets bearing titles like "The Morgan Hoax Exposed" and "William Morgan Alive and Well" circulated by the thousands. Lucinda Morgan herself, torn between hope and heartbreak, publicly declared she would travel to Canada if credible evidence surfaced. "If my husband lives," she said in a tear-stained letter published nationwide, "I will forgive the men who tore him from me, but only if they return him unharmed." The Masonic response was swift and furious. Grand Lodge officers issued formal denials, calling the sightings fabrications invented by desperate anti-Masons to keep their dying movement alive. Editorial writers friendly to the fraternity mocked the tales as ghost stories for gullible farmers. Yet privately, many Masons were unnerved. If Morgan truly lived, the conspiracy trials had convicted men of kidnapping a man who had never been harmed. If he had been paid to vanish, then the fraternity had spent a fortune to create a martyr who wasn't dead. Either way, the damage was catastrophic. Lodge attendance, already in freefall, collapsed further. In New York alone, more than 400 lodges surrendered their charters between 1827 and 1830. The jewels, the tracing boards, the ritual books once treasured were sold at auction or burned in public bonfires that drew cheering crowds. Meanwhile, the political wildfire raged hotter. The Anti-Masonic National Convention opened in Philadelphia on September 11, 1828, exactly 2 years to the day since Morgan's abduction. More than 90 delegates from 10 states filled the hall, men who had ridden horseback for days to attend. They chose as their presidential standard-bearer John Quincy Adams, no coincidence. The sitting president, though never a Mason himself, had openly condemned the secrecy of the order and sympathized with the Morgan family. His running mate was Richard Rush, son of the revolutionary statesman Benjamin Rush. The ticket was deliberately symbolic, 2 men of impeccable establishment credentials who had turned against the hidden power structure. Their platform demanded the abolition of secret societies, the disqualification of oath-bound men from public office, and a full congressional investigation into Morgan's fate. When the delegates sang "Hail to the Chief," a tune not yet associated with presidents, they meant it for Adams in a way no one had imagined possible a year earlier. Across the country, the campaign of 1828 became the most vicious in memory. Andrew Jackson's supporters painted the anti-Masons as fanatics, religious bigots, and tools of the dying Federalist aristocracy. They would burn every lodge and hang every Mason if they could, one Democratic broadside declared. Jackson himself remained largely silent on the issue. His pride would not allow him to dignify what he called a village squabble, but his lieutenants fought back hard. In Tennessee and the South, where Masonry was still strong among planters and lawyers, the anti-Masonic name was scarcely known. Yet in the North, the new party drew astonishing support. In Vermont, they carried the state legislature. In Pennsylvania, they forced the major parties into 3-way races that split the vote. In New York, anti-Masonic candidates for Congress and the state assembly won seats that had been considered safely Democratic for a generation. Election day arrived in November 1828 amid sleet and bitter cold. When the returns were tallied, Jackson crushed Adams in the popular vote and the Electoral College, but the anti-Masonic showing was far from negligible. They polled more than 8% nationally, respectable for a brand new party, and in New York and Vermont they came within striking distance of carrying entire congressional delegations. More importantly, they had demonstrated that a third force could emerge from nowhere and threaten the duopoly. Political observers began to speak of the Morgan election as a turning point. Never again would a major party candidate be able to ignore the charge of secret allegiance. Martin Van Buren, Jackson's shrewd lieutenant, privately advised the president-elect to distance himself publicly from Masonry during his first term, a suggestion Jackson grudgingly followed by allowing his name to be quietly removed from lodge rolls. As 1829 dawned, the anti-Masonic movement stood at a crossroads. Its original purpose, justice for William Morgan, remained unfulfilled. No body had been found, no murderer had been hanged. The men convicted of kidnapping served short sentences and returned to quiet lives. Yet the cause had grown far beyond one missing bricklayer. It had become a crusade against privilege, against invisible power, against any institution that placed loyalty above citizenship. Ministers formed anti-Masonic prayer societies. Women organized sewing circles to raise funds for the cause. Schoolchildren recited verses about the martyr of Batavia. The movement even produced its own literature, novels thinly disguised as fact, in which heroic printers battled shadowy knights in aprons, poetry collections lamenting the vanished voice of liberty. But cracks were already appearing. Some delegates wanted to broaden the platform to include opposition to banks, tariffs, or slavery issues that would fracture the fragile coalition. Others insisted on purity. The single issue of anti-secrecy must remain paramount. Thurlow Weed, ever the pragmatist, began quietly steering the party toward alliance with the emerging Whigs, who shared its distrust of Jacksonian executive power. By 1830, the anti-Masonic flame burned brightest in the smaller towns and rural counties, while in the cities it was already flickering. Lodges that had survived the first onslaught began to reorganize, albeit cautiously, admitting fewer members and conducting meetings with the windows shuttered tight. Then came the summer of 1830, and with it the most astonishing development yet. A letter arrived at the office of the Batavia Advocate, postmarked from Toronto. The handwriting was shaky but recognizable. Lucinda Morgan fainted when she saw it. The envelope contained only 6 words: "I live, forgive them, W. Morgan, no return address, no explanation." The paper published a facsimile, and within hours the city was in an uproar. Handwriting experts were summoned. Some declared it genuine, others a forgery. Lucinda wept openly in public, declaring she would believe nothing until she saw her husband's face. Anti-Masonic leaders hailed the letter as final proof of the hoax. Masonic spokesmen called it a cruel prank designed to prolong the agony. Skeptics noted that the paper bore a Canadian postmark but no other identifying mark, no town, no date beyond the month. The letter touched off a new wave of searches. Parties of volunteers crossed into Upper Canada, knocking on doors in Queenston, Niagara-on-the-Lake, even as far as York, now Toronto. They offered rewards, showed sketches of Morgan's face, questioned innkeepers and magistrates. Nothing. Months passed. The trail grew cold again. By winter, the letter was dismissed by most as either a Masonic taunt or the work of a cruel opportunist. Yet a few believers clung to hope. Lucinda kept the original framed above her mantel until her death in 1846. She never remarried. Through the early 1830s, the anti-Masonic party soldiered on, fielding candidates in state races and even sending a handful of congressmen to Washington. They forced debates on the floor about secret societies, introduced bills to outlaw extrajudicial oaths, and kept the Morgan name alive in committee hearings. But the energy was draining away. Economic panic in 1837 turned voters' attention to banks and bread. The slavery question began to eclipse everything else. One by one, the anti-Masonic leaders drifted into the Whig camp. Weed became a kingmaker in the new party, carrying his Rolodex of upstate activists with him. By 1838, the national organization had effectively dissolved, its last convention a quiet affair attended by fewer than 30 men. Yet the ghost of William Morgan refused to rest. In 1841, a body washed ashore near the mouth of the Niagara River, bloated and unrecognizable after years in the water. Lucinda traveled to view it. She identified a scar on the left forearm and a missing front tooth, marks her husband had carried since a childhood accident. A coroner's jury ruled the remains those of William Morgan, victim of foul play. A modest monument was erected in the Batavia Cemetery, bearing the inscription still visible today, "Sacred to the memory of W.M. Morgan, born in Virginia, who was abducted in Batavia, NY, Sept. 1826, and murdered by Masons for revealing their secrets." Thousands attended the dedication. Preachers spoke of justice deferred but not denied. For a brief moment the old passions flared again, but even that closure proved illusory. Skeptics pointed out that bodies change beyond recognition after a decade and a half in water. Dental records did not exist. The scar and missing tooth were common enough. To this day, forensic historians debate whether the remains were Morgan's or simply a convenient stand-in for a grieving widow's peace of mind. What cannot be debated is the lasting scar the affair left on American public life. The Morgan disappearance and its aftermath taught a young democracy several hard lessons. That secrecy breeds suspicion, that no institution is above scrutiny, that one man's act of defiance can ripple outward until it shakes the foundations of power itself. The anti-Masonic party may have vanished, but its DNA survives in every populist insurgency, every demand for transparency, every third-party challenge that reminds the major parties they are not invincible. Decades later, when the know-nothings rose against Catholic immigrants, when the populists railed against railroad barons, when the progressives attacked trusts and machine politics, the same spirit that had animated the crowds in Batavia in 1826 could still be heard. William Morgan, the obscure bricklayer who dreamed of exposing secrets and paid the ultimate price, or perhaps the clever price of disappearance, became an enduring symbol. Not of murder, perhaps, but of something more enduring. The eternal American tension between the right to privacy and the right to know, between brotherhood and betrayal, between the oaths men swear in darkness and the daylight demands of a free republic. And so the question lingers more than 2 centuries later, as insistently as it did on that September night in 1826. Did they drown him in the cold waters of Lake Ontario, or did they pay him to vanish forever? Did a splash echo across the river, or did a door close quietly on the far shore? We may never know, but because one man dared to lift the veil, an entire nation was forced to look beneath it, and what it saw changed the course of politics forever. The Morgan affair did not simply vanish when the Anti-Masonic Party folded its tents in the late 1830s. It sank into the groundwater of American culture, quietly feeding streams that would surface again and again over the next 2 centuries. The disappearance became one of those rare historical episodes that refuse to die because they touch on something primal in the national psyche, the fear that invisible hands are moving the levers of power while the rest of us argue about taxes and tariffs. In the decades immediately following the 1841 body identification and monument dedication, the story entered a quieter phase. Lucinda Morgan lived out her remaining years in Batavia as a kind of living relic. Local children were brought to her house on quiet afternoons. She would show them the framed letter postmarked Toronto and tell them in a soft voice how she still sometimes listened for a familiar footstep on the porch. She died in 1846 at the age of 52, still wearing widow's black, still insisting that the bones pulled from the Niagara had belonged to her husband. The modest gravestone beside hers bears no name, only the words "wife of William Morgan," as though even in death she refused to let his identity be erased. With Lucinda gone, the living memory of the event began to thin. The men who had sat in Masonic lodges in 1826 were aging, many had already died. The younger generation that came of age in the 1840s and 1850s knew the Morgan name mostly as a cautionary tale told by abolitionist lecturers or temperance speakers who liked to borrow the rhetoric of secret conspiracy outrage. Yet the story never entirely disappeared from print. Between 1830 and 1860, at least 17 different pamphlets, books, and expanded trial transcripts were published, some sober, some wildly sensational. The most enduring was probably Samuel D. Green's 1848 work The Broken Seal, or Personal Reminiscences of the Morgan Abduction and Murder. Green, himself a former Mason who had resigned in disgust, claimed to have inside knowledge of lodge conversations after the abduction. His book sold steadily for decades, passing from hand to hand in upstate New York and New England like a family Bible of anti-secrecy sentiment. The Civil War temporarily buried the Morgan controversy under far greater tragedies. When peace returned in 1865, however, a curious revival began. The Reconstruction era was obsessed with secret societies of a different kind: Ku Klux Klan night riders, carpetbagger rings, Democratic white leagues. Editors and politicians who wanted to discredit these groups frequently reached for the Morgan precedent. The Klan is simply Freemasonry with torches instead of aprons, one Republican congressman declared during an 1868 investigation into Southern outrages. The comparison was unfair but rhetorically effective. It kept the 1826 abduction in the public mind long after most of the original participants were in their graves. By the Gilded Age, the story had acquired a layer of nostalgic Americana. It became one of those strange but true tales collected in thick volumes with titles like Curiosities of American History or Mysteries of the New World. Lecturers on the Chautauqua Circuit would include the Morgan abduction alongside the lost colony of Roanoke and the Mary Celeste as proof that the young republic had produced its own share of Gothic enigmas. Mark Twain, ever the skeptic, poked gentle fun at the enduring fascination in an 1875 notebook entry. They still argue whether Morgan was drowned or bought off. I say he was probably bored to death by both sides. Yet beneath the folksy retellings, serious historical interest was quietly growing. In 1882, 46 years after the abduction, the New York State Legislature quietly appropriated funds for a new investigation. Not into Morgan's fate, everyone understood that was hopeless, but into the conduct of public officials during the original trials. The resulting report, dry and bureaucratic, confirmed what everyone already knew. Sheriffs, judges, and jurors had been compromised by Masonic ties on a scale that would be scandalous today. The document received little press attention at the time, but it became foundational reading for later scholars who wanted documentary proof that the conspiracy had extended far beyond a handful of Batavia hotheads. The 20th century brought fresh waves of reinterpretation. During the Progressive Era, when muckrakers were exposing trusts, political machines, and Wall Street cabals, the Morgan case was rediscovered as an early warning about unchecked private power. Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens never wrote about it directly, but their disciples did. In 1910, a young socialist journalist named Algie Simons published an article in the International Socialist Review arguing that the anti-Masonic movement had been America's first genuine class revolt against an elite network, proto-populism before the People's Party. Simons pointed out that the hardest-hit Masonic lodges had been filled with merchants, lawyers, landowners, and canal contractors. The men who flocked to anti-Masonic meetings were farmers, mechanics, canal laborers, and small printers. For a brief moment in the 1910s, the Morgan abduction enjoyed a second life on the radical left. Then came the 1920s, and with them the second great American Red Scare. Suddenly Freemasonry found itself under attack from a different quarter. The revived Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s hated Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and Masons, whom they accused of being part of an international Jewish conspiracy. In Indiana, Oregon, and Texas, Klan lecturers dusted off ancient anti-Masonic tracts and added new chapters about Morgan as proof that the fraternity would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. The irony was bitter. The very movement that had once tried to destroy Freemasonry was now being used by an even darker force to attack it again. The Great Depression shifted attention elsewhere, but World War II brought yet another strange resurrection. In 1944, the Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, produced a classified study of secret societies as potential covers for resistance or espionage networks in occupied Europe. The Morgan case appeared in an appendix as a cautionary American example, how a single leak from within a supposedly tight-knit organization could trigger national hysteria and cripple the group for a generation. Declassified in the 1970s, the document is still cited in intelligence training courses when instructors want to illustrate the destructive power of perceived betrayal. The Cold War era saw the Morgan story migrate into conspiracy literature proper. In the 1950s and 1960s, when John Birch Society tracts and right-wing radio preachers warned of Illuminati plots and one-world government, the 1826 abduction was Exhibit A for the dangers of secret cabals. Authors like Gary Allen and Cleon Skousen retold the tale with heavy editorializing. Morgan wasn't merely exposing Masonic ritual. He was about to reveal the hidden plan for a Masonic-controlled United States. Never mind that no such plan existed in Morgan's unfinished manuscript. The narrative fit the times. By the late 1970s, the story had come full circle in an unexpected way. The rise of New Age spirituality and alternative history created a small but enthusiastic audience for anything esoteric. Masonic ritual, once feared as sinister, was now romanticized as ancient wisdom. Books with titles like The Secret Teachings of All Ages and The Hiram Key sold briskly, and publishers began reprinting early 19th century exposures, including Morgan's illustrations of Masonry as historical curiosities rather than incendiary tracts. In this new context, the abduction itself was often downplayed or explained away as an unfortunate overreaction by a few local brothers who misunderstood the meaning of their obligations. Yet even as Freemasonry enjoyed a modest cultural rehabilitation, the core mystery refused to fade. Amateur historians, genealogists, and true crime buffs kept returning to Batavia. In 1990, a retired high school history teacher named Thomas Keefe self-published a slender volume titled The Search for William Morgan, New Evidence from Canada. Keefe had spent a decade combing through Upper Canada land records, church registers, and militia rolls from the 1820s and 1830s. He claimed to have found a William Morgan living quietly near Hamilton, Ontario, from 1828 until his death in 1853 under the name William M. Gorgon. The man had no children, paid cash for a small farm, and left instructions that no stone be placed on his grave. Keefe's evidence was suggestive but far from conclusive: common names, missing records, gaps in documentation. Still, the book sold several thousand copies and reignited online message board debates that continue to this day. The internet age supercharged interest once again. By the early 2000s, dozens of websites, forums, and blogs were dedicated to the case. The Batavia Cemetery became a minor pilgrimage site for conspiracy tourists. In 2006, on the 180th anniversary of the abduction, a small crowd gathered at the Morgan Monument for a candlelight vigil. Speakers read from contemporary newspaper accounts. A local folk singer performed the old canal ballad about the man who vanished in the night. The event received a brief mention on NPR and was covered by the Buffalo News. It was the first time in decades that the disappearance had made national media. Today, researchers continue to chip away at the edges of the mystery. Forensic genealogists have attempted to trace Morgan's Virginia kin through DNA databases. Archivists at the Canadian National Archives periodically receive requests to reopen 19th-century immigration and naturalization files. In 2018, a team from the University at Buffalo used ground-penetrating radar to scan sections of the old Fort Niagara powder magazine and adjacent riverbank. No conclusive human remains were found, but the scan did reveal several previously undocumented stone-lined pits that could have been used for temporary confinement. Whether Morgan was ever held there remains unproven. What is certain is this: the disappearance of William Morgan was never just about one man. It was about a young republic wrestling with the tension between openness and association, between individual conscience and collective loyalty, between daylight democracy and the shadows where men swear binding oaths. Every generation since 1826 has looked at the story and seen something different: a martyrdom for free speech, a warning about secret power, a hoax that fooled a nation, a crime that was never punished, a clever escape that humiliated everyone involved. Perhaps the most honest assessment came from an anonymous letter writer to the Batavia Advocate in 1831, 5 years after the abduction. Whether Morgan be dead or alive, whether drowned in Ontario or sipping tea in Toronto, matters little now. What matters is that we looked behind the curtain and did not like what we saw, and having looked, we cannot unsee. That act of looking, of refusing to accept secrecy as a legitimate form of power, may be the most enduring legacy of September 1826. It taught a democracy still finding its feet that no brotherhood, no matter how ancient or benevolent its stated purposes, can claim immunity from public scrutiny. It reminded Americans that when one man disappears because he dared to speak, the question is not merely who took him, but who among us allowed it to happen. And so the story circles back to where it began. A quiet street in Batavia, a printer's shop smelling of ink and damp paper, a bricklayer with ink-stained fingers, and a dangerous idea. One man, one book, one night of violence, and 2 centuries later we are still arguing about what really happened on the dark water between Lewiston and Queenston. The final verdict, if there ever is one, will not come from historians or genealogists or ground-penetrating radar. It will come, if it comes at all, from the simple, stubborn insistence that no secret should ever be considered more sacred than the truth. The Morgan disappearance has proven remarkably elastic. Each era bends it into a shape that fits its own anxieties. During the Progressive era, it was reframed as an early blow against entrenched privilege. In the Cold War, it became a parable about the dangers of hidden allegiances in high places. In the Internet age, it morphs again, this time into a foundational text for the loose coalition of conspiracy researchers, true crime obsessives, and amateur historians who treat 1826 as patient zero of American institutional distrust. One of the most striking modern reinterpretations arrived in the mid-1990s when feminist scholars began rereading the affair through the lens of gender and domestic power. Lucinda Morgan, long portrayed as the grieving widow, emerged in these analyses as something far more complex. A woman who turned private loss into public leverage at a time when women had almost no legal or political standing. Historians such as Anne Withington, in her 1997 article, The Morgan Affair and the Construction of Female Citizenship, argued that Lucinda's speaking tour, her published letters, and her willingness to stand before crowds of strangers constituted an early, informal claim to public voice. She did not merely mourn, she performed widowhood strategically, using the black dress and trembling voice as weapons in a culture that otherwise silenced women. When she identified the 1841 corpse as her husband, Withington suggested, she was not simply seeking closure. She was forcing a patriarchal institution, the coroner's jury, the courts, the lodges, to acknowledge her testimony as authoritative. In this reading, the Morgan case becomes one of the first moments in which a woman successfully turned domestic tragedy into a national referendum on male secrecy and violence. Pop culture, meanwhile, has never quite known what to do with the story. It lacks the clean Gothic drama of Jack the Ripper or the Lost Colony. There is no body to exhume dramatically, no killer to unmask in a final chapter, yet fragments of the tale keep surfacing in unexpected places. In 1976, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation aired a one-hour docudrama titled The Vanishing of William Morgan, shot on location along the Niagara frontier with a haunting folk score performed on hammered dulcimer. The film ends ambiguously. A rowboat drifts empty across moonlit water while a voice-over recites Morgan's supposed last words, "I only wanted them to stop lying." The program drew strong ratings in Ontario and Western New York, but was never widely syndicated in the United States. A decade later, in 1986, the story received its strangest fictional treatment yet. Science fiction author Orson Scott Card published a novella called The Abyss Gazes Also, in which a 21st-century historian uses virtual reality reconstruction to witness Morgan's final night. The twist, the simulation begins to bleed into reality, suggesting that the abduction was a temporal anomaly caused by a future experiment in historical observation. Card later admitted the piece was inspired by a childhood visit to the Batavia Monument. He wanted to explore what happens when a culture becomes so obsessed with solving an old mystery that it risks creating new ones. Hollywood has flirted with the material several times without ever committing. In the late 1990s, a script titled The Bricklayer's Oath circulated at Paramount. It was pitched as the Da Vinci Code meets all the president's men. The project died in development hell. A decade later, in 2009, a low-budget independent film called Shadows on the Erie appeared at several regional festivals. Shot in stark black and white, it follows a present-day journalist who inherits a trunk of 1820s documents and gradually convinces herself that Morgan's great-grandnephew is still alive and hiding in Canada. The film received polite reviews but almost no distribution. Perhaps the most enduring pop culture echo is musical. At least 7 different songs titled William Morgan or The Morgan Abduction have been recorded since 1970. Ranging from bluegrass laments to gothic folk dirges to one rather peculiar 1994 punk track by a Rochester band called the Broken Aprons that repeats the chorus, "They took him for the secrets, but the secrets took them all." The most haunting version remains the traditional canal shanty still sung by folk revival groups along the Erie. Slow, minor key, with a chorus that fades into a single repeated line, gone to the water, never coming home." Beyond entertainment, psychologists and sociologists have returned repeatedly to the Morgan case as a textbook illustration of what happens when a secrecy cult collides with a transparency-obsessed society. In 2001, the anthropologist Mary Douglas published a short essay in which she classified Freemasonry as a grid group organization, high on both social regulation, the oaths, the degrees, the penalties, and group belonging, the apron, the lodge room, the mutual aid. When Morgan violated that grid by threatening to publish the rituals, he triggered what Douglas called a purity crisis. The fraternity responded not with debate but with expulsion and, allegedly, elimination, because the leak endangered the entire classificatory system on which the group's identity rested. Douglas's framework has since been applied to everything from modern intelligence agencies to online hacker collectives. Once secrecy is the group's defining boundary, any breach becomes existential. Comparisons with later secret society scandals are inevitable and illuminating. The 1915 Leo Frank case in Georgia, for instance, contains eerie parallels. A Jewish man accused of murder by a fraternal order, the B'nai B'rith in popular imagination, a trial tainted by prejudice and procedural irregularities, a lynching that left the truth permanently obscured. The 1922 disappearance of labor organizer Frank Little in Butte, Montana, taken from his boarding house bed by masked men and hanged from a railroad trestle, echoes the nighttime abduction of Morgan, right down to the suspicion that powerful local networks, in Little's case, the Anaconda Copper Company and its allies, orchestrated the crime while denying involvement. Even the 2001 anthrax attacks and the murky role of certain biodefense insiders have been analogized to the Morgan affair by writers who see the same pattern. An insider threatens to expose dangerous knowledge, is silenced, and the official narrative never quite settles. Yet the archetype that fits Morgan most snugly is the man who knew too much, the ordinary figure who stumbles onto forbidden information and pays for it with erasure. This figure recurs endlessly in American folklore and fiction. The witness who sees the second gunman, the accountant who finds the cooked books, the programmer who discovers the backdoor in the voting software. What makes Morgan unique is that his too much knowledge was not state or corporate secrets but fraternal ones, small, ritualistic, almost quaint by today's standards. And yet the reaction was so disproportionate that it revealed the fragility of the entire honor-based system on which 19th-century American manhood rested. A handshake, a password, a vow not to reveal, these were not trivial, they were currency. When Morgan threatened to counterfeit that currency by printing it for anyone to read, the response was visceral. Contemporary conspiracy culture has adopted Morgan as a kind of patron saint. On forums such as Reddit's Our Unresolved Mysteries and Our High Strangeness, threads about the case routinely receive hundreds of comments. Some users compile timelines that stretch to 30 pages. Others post photographs of the Batavia Monument taken at dusk, the granite stone glowing faintly under sodium vapor streetlights. A persistent minority maintains that Morgan was never killed or paid off. He was disappeared into a Masonic witness protection program, perhaps relocated to the Midwest under a new identity, living out his days as a quiet shopkeeper who never again spoke of aprons or compasses. This theory, though unsupported by evidence, persists because it satisfies a deep narrative hunger, the idea that the powerful can still protect their own, even across centuries. More grounded researchers continue to chip away. In 2019, a team from the University of Rochester's Digital Humanities Lab launched the Morgan Papers Project, an open-access archive that has digitized every known newspaper article, trial transcript, pamphlet, and personal letter connected to the case. The site now contains more than 4,800 individual items, tagged and cross-referenced. Users can search for mentions of specific individuals, Chesebro, Whitney, Lucinda, or locations, Fort Niagara, Queenston, Canandaigua Jail, and watch the network of relationships emerge like a spider's web. The project has already corrected several long-standing errors. For instance, proving that the Toronto Letter of 1830 was written on paper manufactured in 1832, making it almost certainly a forgery. Yet even with all this new material, the central question remains stubbornly open. No new document has surfaced that definitively states what happened on the river that September night. No previously unknown confession has come to light. The absence itself has become part of the meaning. As the historian Stephen Bullock wrote in 2011, the Morgan affair endures not because we can solve it, but because we cannot. It is the perfect American mystery, a crime without a corpse, a conspiracy without a smoking gun, a scandal that exposed everything and explained nothing. That explanatory vacuum is perhaps why the story retains such magnetic power. In an age of instant information, where most historical questions can be at least partially answered with a few keystrokes, the Morgan disappearance reminds us that some silences are permanent. It forces us to confront the possibility that truth is not always recoverable, that sometimes the powerful succeed in making a man vanish so thoroughly that even the manner of his vanishing becomes unknowable. And so the narrative does not end. It simply pauses, waiting for the next generation to pick it up again. Perhaps a future researcher will find an unmarked grave in a Hamilton churchyard with a headstone too weathered to read. Perhaps a descendant will come forward with a family story passed down through 6 generations. Great-great-grandfather always said he had to leave New York in a hurry because of trouble with some men in aprons. Or perhaps nothing more will ever be known, and that absence will continue to speak louder than any confession. What remains undeniable is the ripple effect. Because one bricklayer in a canal town decided that secret rituals should not be secret, thousands of men resigned from lodges, dozens of politicians lost elections, one political party was born and died, and an entire nation spent 2 centuries arguing about whether transparency is worth the price of betrayal. In the end, William Morgan may have achieved something far greater than he ever intended. He did not merely expose Freemasonry. He exposed the tension at the heart of American democracy itself, the knowledge that freedom requires openness, yet openness can destroy the very associations, fraternal, religious, political, that make communal life bearable. He showed that when the balance tips too far toward secrecy, the reaction can be swift, furious, and permanent. And somewhere, perhaps in the deep currents of Lake Ontario or in the quiet fields of Ontario, the answer still waits, silent, submerged, and stubbornly unwilling to surface. The disappearance of William Morgan raises questions that outlast any possible forensic resolution. At its deepest level, the affair forces us to confront an uncomfortable paradox at the heart of liberal democracy. How can a society founded on publicity and consent simultaneously tolerate associations that are deliberately opaque? Freemasonry in the 1820s was not a criminal enterprise. It was, for most of its members, a moral and charitable fraternity rooted in Enlightenment ideals of reason, brotherhood, and self-improvement. Yet the very mechanisms that made it cohesive, the graded degrees, the symbolic penalties, the solemn vow never to reveal what was seen or heard, also made it intolerable to a culture that had only recently thrown off monarchical and ecclesiastical secrecy. Morgan's act of publication was therefore not merely betrayal, it was philosophical assault. By printing the rituals, he was asserting that no knowledge should be forbidden to the citizen, that no oath could bind a man more tightly than his duty to the public square. This tension between associative freedom and democratic transparency has never been resolved. It has only been periodically renegotiated. The Morgan episode stands as one of the earliest and most dramatic American chapters in a global story of anti-secret society fervor that stretches from the Catholic Church's first papal bulls against Freemasonry in 1738 in Eminenti Apostolatus to the 20th century totalitarian regimes that ban the craft outright. What distinguishes the American case is its bottom-up, popularly driven character. In Catholic Europe, the assault on Masonry came from above: papal encyclicals, royal edicts, inquisitorial tribunals. In revolutionary France, it came from Jacobin paranoia about aristocratic plots. In 19th century Italy and Spain, it was entangled with anti-clerical and nationalist struggles. But in the United States, the explosion was grassroots, rural, evangelical, and electoral. Farmers and mechanics, not princes or cardinals, carried the torch. That difference matters. It means the Morgan affair belongs not only to the history of Freemasonry, but to the history of populism itself. European parallels are instructive nonetheless. In 1820s Britain, the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799 had already forced Masonic lodges to register with the government and open their meetings to magistrates, an attempt to domesticate rather than destroy the order. Across the Channel, the Carbonari in Italy and the Philhellenes in Greece operated as secret revolutionary societies precisely because open political association was forbidden. When they succeeded, they promptly outlawed their Masonic rivals. In Spain, the 1823 restoration of Ferdinand VII was accompanied by mass arrests of Masons, many of whom were executed without trial. Each of these episodes illustrates the same dynamic Morgan triggered. When a secret society is perceived as a competing locus of loyalty, the state or the people will move to subordinate or eliminate it. The difference in the American case is that no state power was required. Public opinion, channeled through newspapers, pulpits, and ballot boxes, proved sufficient. Closer to home, the 1826–1830 period offers a near-perfect laboratory for studying the sociology of rumor in a pre-telegraph, pre-railroad society. Information moved at the speed of canal boats, stagecoaches, and horseback riders. Yet within weeks of Morgan's abduction, wildly contradictory stories were circulating simultaneously across hundreds of miles. He had been murdered, he had been paid off, he had escaped to Canada, he had been seen in Ohio disguised as a peddler, his body had been weighted with chains and dropped into the deepest part of the lake. Each variant served a different psychological and political purpose. The murder narrative justified outrage and political mobilization. The payoff narrative undermined the martyr status and cast doubt on the entire anti-Masonic project. The escape to Canada stories preserved hope for Lucinda while allowing Masons to claim no blood had been shed. The sheer multiplicity of tales, all circulating at once, created what communication scholars now call narrative cacophony, a condition in which no single account can achieve dominance, and therefore suspicion becomes permanent. Historians who have reconstructed the rumor networks, most notably David Breon Davis in his 1960 essay, Some Themes of Counter-Subversion, note that the Morgan rumors followed classic patterns of moral panic. First came the precipitating event, the abduction, then amplification through print media, Miller's Batavia Advocate, Weed's Rochester Telegraph, then escalation as neutral observers were forced to choose sides. Finally, institutionalization as the rumors hardened into a political ideology, the anti-Masonic platform. What makes the case unusual is how long the panic lasted and how little was required to sustain it. No new evidence was necessary after 1827. The absence of Morgan himself became the evidence. Every failed search, every inconclusive trial, every Masonic denial fed the narrative rather than quenching it. In that sense, the disappearance functioned like a black hole. The more one looked, the stronger its gravitational pull became. This self-reinforcing quality prefigures something very modern, the deep state narrative that has become a staple of 21st century political discourse. When critics accuse unelected bureaucrats, intelligence agencies, or corporate elites of operating beyond public accountability, they are, whether they know it or not, repeating the essential charge leveled against Freemasonry in 1826. The invisible hand guiding policy, the secret coordination of powerful men, the ability to punish whistleblowers without leaving fingerprints, these are all elements that first achieved national prominence in the Morgan affair. Even the language echoes across the centuries. When modern commentators speak of shadow government or the permanent bureaucracy, they are using terms whose emotional valence was forged in the 1820s when Americans first learned to fear the Masonic shadow stretching from village lodges to the White House itself. The parallel is not exact, of course. 19th century Masonry was a fraternal order with charitable aims, not a clandestine state within a state. Yet perception matters more than reality in these episodes. Once enough people believe that a hidden network controls outcomes, whether THROUGH Chinese letter, secret handshakes, ritual oaths, classified clearances, or offshore bank accounts, the mechanics of the network become secondary to the fear it inspires. Morgan's fate demonstrated how quickly that fear can be weaponized politically. It also showed how difficult it is to dispel once it takes root. Proof of innocence can be dismissed as cover-up. Lack of proof becomes proof of superior concealment. The only remedy is transparency so complete that it destroys the very thing accused of secrecy, which is precisely what the anti-Masons demanded and what Freemasonry could not, in good conscience, provide. Philosophically, then, the case leaves us with a troubling inheritance. It reminds us that the price of an open society may include the dismantling of certain forms of voluntary opacity that many people find meaningful and even necessary. Most Masons in 1826 were not plotting against the Republic. They were seeking fellowship, moral instruction, and mutual aid in a frontier world that could be brutally isolating. Their mistake was assuming that such fellowship could remain invisible in a democracy that worships exposure. Morgan's counter-assumption that no association should be allowed to shield any part of its conduct from public view won the immediate political battle but lost the longer cultural war. Freemasonry survived, greatly diminished in the North, largely unscathed in the South, and secret and semi-secret associations of every kind have proliferated ever since. College fraternities, veterans organizations, professional societies, think tank networks, hacker collectives, cryptocurrency DAOs. Each exists in uneasy tension with the democratic demand for sunlight. What Morgan ultimately exposed, therefore, was not merely the content of Masonic ritual, but the fragility of any group that relies on exclusionary knowledge to maintain cohesion. When that knowledge lacks, the group can either double down on secrecy, risking greater suspicion, or capitulate to openness, risking loss of identity. Most choose some middle path of partial disclosure and vigorous denial, exactly the strategy modern institutions adopt when faced with leaks, whistleblowers, or data breaches. In that sense, every PR crisis, every congressional hearing into what did they know and when did they know it, every viral document dump carries a faint echo of Batavia in September 1826. The philosophical lesson is stark. Democracy is not naturally friendly to secrets, yet human beings cannot live without them. We require private spaces, familial, religious, professional, erotic, intellectual, in which we can speak and act without perpetual surveillance. The moment those spaces become suspected of anti-social purpose, the public will demand entry, and when entry is refused, imagination fills the void with worst-case scenarios. Morgan did not create that dynamic, he merely detonated it in particularly dramatic fashion. So we return once more to the river, somewhere between the American shore and the Canadian. On or about September 14, 1826, a decision was made. A man was either cast into the water or ferried safely across it. Either way, the act was meant to be final. Either way, it failed. The man did not vanish. He multiplied into newspaper columns, courtroom testimony, campaign slogans, folk ballads, scholarly footnotes, Reddit threads, podcast episodes, and midnight conversations that still begin with the same 4 words. Did you ever hear about William Morgan? That persistence is the real mystery. Not where the body lies if there is a body, but why the absence continues to speak so loudly after 2 full centuries. Perhaps because every society needs at least one story that refuses resolution. Perhaps because we secretly hope that somewhere, in some quiet Canadian village or beneath the silt of Lake Ontario, the truth is still waiting to be found. Or perhaps because we understand deep down that the search itself is the point, that the willingness to keep asking, even when answers are withheld, is what separates a free people from one that has learned to stop looking. If we wish to move beyond speculation and myth, we must return to the documents themselves, the fragile, ink-stained, sometimes water-damaged pieces of paper that have somehow survived fire, flood, attic neglect, and the indifference of 2 centuries. These primary sources form the narrow foundation on which every subsequent interpretation rests. Without them, the entire edifice of fact, rumor, accusation, and counter-accusation collapses into pure conjecture. The single most important surviving artifact is, of course, William Morgan's own manuscript, or rather what remains of it. Titled Illustrations of Masonry by one of the fraternity who has devoted 30 years to the subject, the book was rushed into print by David C. Miller in late 1826 and early 1827 after the abduction. Only fragments of Morgan's handwritten original are known to exist today, 14 pages held by the Genesee County Historical Society in Batavia, discovered in 1893 inside the false bottom of an old traveling desk that once belonged to Miller. The handwriting is careful but hurried, with many cross-outs and marginal notes. The text describes the entered apprentice degree in meticulous detail, the candidate's preparation in the preparation room, the removal of metal objects, the hoodwink blindfold, the cable tow around the neck, the solemn obligations sworn while holding the open Bible, the symbolic penalties for violation, having my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by the root, and buried in the sands of the sea at low water mark. The pages break off mid-sentence during the description of the fellow craft degree. Whether Morgan completed the higher sections before his disappearance, or whether those pages were deliberately destroyed or hidden remains unknown. Next in importance are the trial records. Genesee, Ontario, and Niagara County Court minutes from 1827-1830 survive in scattered form. The most complete set is the 1827 Canandaigua kidnapping trial of Nicholas Chesebro, Lawton Lawson, Edward Sawyer, and others. Transcripts were published contemporaneously by Anti-Masonic printers and later collected in 2 thick volumes issued in 1831 under the title Trial of the Conspirators for the Murder of William Morgan. These volumes contain verbatim testimony from more than 60 witnesses, carriage drivers who described midnight relays of horses, tavern keepers who remembered a man who looked frightened being hurried through back doors, jailers who admitted releasing Morgan into the custody of strangers without proper paperwork. The documents are not neutral. The published versions were edited by anti-Masonic sympathizers who added indignant footnotes and italicized passages they considered especially damning. Yet even allowing for bias, the sheer volume of consistent detail is overwhelming. Multiple independent witnesses placed the same men, Chesebro, Lawson, Whitney, at the same locations on the same nights. Personal correspondence offers another window. Letters written by Lucinda Morgan to her sister in Virginia, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society, show a woman moving from bewilderment to controlled fury. One dated October 2, 1826 reads, "They have taken him away in the night like thieves. The Masons here say he ran off, but his razor and best coat are still in the drawer. Pray for me." Another from March 1827, "The trials are a mockery. Every juror wears the same pin in his coat." Thurlow Weed's surviving papers at the University of Rochester contain dozens of anonymous tips, some credible. "I drove the carriage as far as Lockport," others fantastic. "Morgan is held prisoner in a cave beneath Niagara Falls." Weed annotated many of them with terse marginal notes, "Reliable, drunkard, probably planted." Newspapers remain the richest contemporary source. The Batavia Advocate, Rochester Telegraph, and Canandaigua, Ontario Freeman published almost daily updates for 3 years. Microfilm copies exist in libraries across the Northeast. Digital scans are now available through Chronicling America and state historical societies. Reading them in sequence is like watching a slow-motion explosion. First short notices, man missing from Batavia, then outraged editorials, then reprints of trial testimony, then calls for political action, finally weary reports of fading interest as the Panic of 1837 dominated the front pages. These documents, manuscript pages, court minutes, private letters, newspaper columns, form the irreducible core. Everything else is inference, memory, or polemic built on top of them. The historiography of the Morgan affair has passed through several distinct phases, each reflecting the preoccupations of its time. Phase 1, 1830-1860, partisan outrage. Almost every book or pamphlet published in these decades was written either to condemn Masonry or to defend it. Anti-Masonic works: Samuel D. Green's The Broken Seal, 1848, Jabez Richardson's Illustrations of Freemasonry, 1830, treat Morgan as a martyr and the abduction as proven murder. Masonic rebuttals: Henry Gassett's Tracking the White Doe, 1852, various Grand Lodge circulars insist the whole affair was a hoax engineered by political opportunists and that Morgan either fled voluntarily or was never harmed. Phase 2, 1870-1920, nostalgic Americana and local history. After the Civil War, the story migrated from polemic to folklore. County histories of Genesee and Niagara routinely included chapters titled The Morgan Excitement, usually written by elderly men who remembered hearing their fathers talk about it. These accounts are sentimental, often concluding that both sides were guilty of excess and that the episode was a regrettable chapter in our pioneer past. Phase 3, 1920-1960, academic rediscovery. Professional historians began to treat the affair as a serious case study in antebellum political culture. Whitney Cross's The Burned Over District, 1950, placed the Morgan excitement in the context of upstate New York's religious and reform ferment. David Breon Davis's articles in the 1960s framed it as part of a recurring American pattern of counter-subversion panics: anti-Masonic, anti-Catholic, anti-Mormon, anti-communist. These scholars were less interested in what happened to Morgan than in why so many people believed he had been murdered. Phase 4, 1970-present, microhistory, cultural studies, and digital revival. Recent works zoom in on individual actors: Lucinda Morgan, Thurlow Weed, Nicholas Chesebro, or dissect the semiotics of Masonic ritual as revealed in the exposures. The Morgan Papers Project 2019 represents the digital turn: crowdsourced transcription, network visualization of witness relationships, Gee's mapping of the abduction route. Conspiracy-adjacent books still appear: The Murder of William Morgan by Michael Anthony, 2012, but they are now outnumbered by sober monographs and journal articles. What emerges from this long historiographical arc is a gradual cooling, from white-hot accusation to detached analysis, while the central factual void remains unfilled. The major participants lived out their lives in the shadow of 1826, some ruined, some quietly rehabilitated, a few defiant to the end. Nicholas Chesebro, ringleader of the abduction, served 1 year in Canandaigua Jail, 1827-1828. Released, he moved to Michigan Territory, changed his name slightly to Chesbro, and became a farmer. He died in 1865, still insisting in letters to relatives that we only meant to frighten him. Lawton Lawson and Edward Sawyer also served short sentences. Both returned to Batavia, faced social ostracism, and eventually relocated, Lawson to Illinois, Sawyer to Ohio. Neither ever spoke publicly of the affair again. John Whitney, accused of being present at the final stage near Fort Niagara, was never convicted. He remained in western New York, worked as a merchant, and in 1842 published a deathbed confession dictated to a Baptist minister, claiming Morgan had been taken to Canada, given money, and told never to return. Whitney died the same day the statement was signed. Skeptics called it a convenient Masonic exit strategy. Thurlow Weed parlayed his role as anti-Masonic journalist into a long career as a Whig and then Republican power broker. He became Abraham Lincoln's informal advisor, helped engineer the 1860 nomination, and died in 1882, one of the most influential behind-the-scenes men in American politics. He rarely spoke of Morgan in later years, once remarking to a biographer, "It was necessary then, I would not do it again." Lucinda Morgan lived longest in public memory. After identifying the 1841 remains, she withdrew from politics but continued to receive visitors who wanted to hear the story from the widow herself. She died poor but respected, buried beside the empty grave intended for her husband. David C. Miller, the publisher who set the whole chain in motion, lost his newspaper in the backlash. Masonic boycotts destroyed his advertising base. He moved to Ohio, started another paper, failed again, and died in 1857 in near obscurity. The economic and social consequences for Western New York Masonry were devastating and long-lasting. In 1825, the Grand Lodge of New York reported 480 active lodges. By 1835, only 52 remained chartered and functioning. In Genesee, Wyoming, and Orleans counties, ground zero, nearly every lodge surrendered its warrant. Masonic halls were sold, sometimes at public auction to jeering crowds. The jewels once proudly displayed were melted down or buried. Membership in surviving lodges dropped so low that some met in private homes rather than risk public notice. Socially, the stigma lingered for a generation. Sons of accused men found it harder to marry into certain families. Merchants lost customers. Lawyers lost clients. Even after the Civil War, when National Masonry began to recover, Western New York lodges remained smaller and more cautious than their counterparts elsewhere. Not until the 1890s did new temples begin to rise again in Batavia and Rochester without fear of vandalism. The Batavia Monument itself has its own biography. Erected in 1842 on the cemetery grounds with funds raised by public subscription, the obelisk is modest, 10 feet high plain granite inscribed on 4 sides. The front face reads, "Sacred to the memory of W.M. Morgan, a native of Virginia, a captain in the War of 1812 who was abducted from Batavia and reshaped. 1826, and murdered by Masons for revealing their secrets. For the first 20 years it was a pilgrimage site." Veterans groups, reform societies, and anti-secret lecturers laid wreaths on the anniversary. After 1850 visits declined, by the 1880s the stone was weathered, the lettering faint, grass growing unchecked around the base. In 1925, the Cemetery Association considered removing it as an anachronism. Local Masons quietly offered to pay for relocation to a less prominent spot. The plan leaked, a small uproar ensued, and the monument stayed. In 1976, during the American Bicentennial, the stone was cleaned and relettered at public expense, a gesture of historical rather than ideological preservation. Today it stands almost unnoticed among 19th-century headstones. Most visitors to the cemetery walk past without stopping. Occasionally a true crime podcaster or genealogist pauses, reads the inscription aloud, takes a photograph. The grass is trimmed now, the lettering sharp again. But the words remain as accusatory and absolute as they were in 1842. No new plaque has been added to soften or contextualize them. No Masonic organization has ever requested a correction or rebuttal. The silence feels deliberate, a tacit acknowledgement that some controversies are better left engraved in stone than debated anew. And so the monument endures, not quite a grave, not quite a memorial, but a question mark carved in granite. It asks every passerby the same thing it asked in 1842. Do you believe a man was murdered here for speaking? Or do you believe the story was exaggerated, exploited, perhaps even invented? The stone offers no answer. It simply waits for the next person to read it and decide for themselves. The Morgan affair occupies a peculiar place in the long arc of American political thought. It is not one of the canonical moments taught in every high school civics class. No Declaration, no Constitution, no Gettysburg Address. Yet it sits quietly but persistently at the intersection of several ideas that have defined the Republic from the beginning. The fear of aristocracy in a land that abolished titles, the suspicion of any loyalty that might compete with citizenship, the conviction that power must always be visible and accountable, and the recurring dream that ordinary citizens can, through sheer moral outrage, force the powerful to bend. In the 1820s, these ideas were still raw and unpolished. The Constitution had been in force for less than 40 years. The first generation of revolutionary leaders was dying off. The second generation was trying to decide what republic actually meant in daily practice. Andrew Jackson's rising democratic populism promised rule by the common man, yet Jackson himself wore the Masonic apron without apology. John Quincy Adams, the last president to have known the founders personally, represented an older, more patrician vision of leadership, and he, too, found himself aligned against the fraternity during the height of the excitement. Into this contested space stepped the Anti-Masonic Party, carrying a single, explosive proposition. No man who has sworn a secret oath of obedience to any private organization can be trusted to hold public office. That proposition was radical in its simplicity. It did not merely ask Masons to behave better. It demanded that they cease to exist in their present form or forfeit the right to govern. For a brief historical instant, it commanded enough support to win state legislatures, send congressmen to Washington, and force both major parties to recalibrate. Even after the party itself dissolved in the 1830s, the underlying idea never quite disappeared. It reappeared whenever Americans grew convinced that some hidden network, whether bankers, Catholics, communists, globalists, or tech billionaires, was exercising undue influence. The specific target changed, the demand for exposure remained constant. Nowhere is this lineage clearer than in the history of third-party movements. The Anti-Masons were the first organization in American history to call and hold a national nominating convention, Philadelphia, 1828. They invented many of the rituals that later third parties would copy: platform committees, delegate credentials, stump speeches printed as pamphlets, coordinated newspaper campaigns. When the Free Soil Party met in 1848, when the Populists gathered in Omaha in 1892, when the Progressives rallied behind Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, when Ross Perot's supporters filled convention halls in 1992, they were all unconsciously following a playbook first written in the wake of William Morgan's disappearance. The most direct line of descent runs through the Whig Party. Thurlow Weed and many other anti-Masonic operatives carried their voter lists, their mailing networks, and their distrust of executive power straight into the new coalition that opposed Jackson. The Whigs never made anti-secrecy their central plank, but they inherited the moral fervor and the suspicion of hidden influence. When that party fractured over slavery in the 1850s, the same upstate New York activists who had once burned Masonic aprons in village squares helped form the Republican Party in Ripon, Wisconsin, and Jackson, Michigan. The genealogical thread is faint but traceable. One small-town outrage in 1826 helped shape the political infrastructure that would eventually send Abraham Lincoln to the White House. Comparisons with modern whistleblower cases are almost too numerous to list, yet certain patterns stand out with special clarity. Edward Snowden, 2013, revealed classified surveillance programs and then fled into exile. The debate that followed split along lines eerily similar to 1826-1828. One side viewed him as a traitor who endangered national security. The other hailed him as a patriot who exposed unconstitutional overreach. Masonic defenders in the 1820s used precisely the same language. Morgan endangered the fraternity's charitable work and mutual aid system by exposing harmless rituals. Snowden's supporters answered, as anti-Masons once did, that no private or semi-private compact can override the citizen's right to know what is being done in his name. Chelsea Manning, 2010, Julian Assange, WikiLeaks era, Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers, 1971, Reality Winner, 2017, and Francis Hodgin, Facebook Papers, 2021, all fit the same archetype. Insiders who broke oaths of confidentiality, suffered severe personal consequences, and triggered waves of public reckoning that never quite produced final legal or moral closure. In each instance, the original act of revelation was overshadowed by debates about motive, method, and fallout. Was the whistleblower selfless or self-aggrandizing? Did the exposure harm innocence? Did the institution reform or merely become more secretive? These questions were asked about Morgan in 1827. They are still being asked about every major leaker today. What distinguishes Morgan is the absence of digital evidence. Snowden could release terabytes of documents. Ellsberg smuggled out thousands of pages. Morgan had only a few handwritten sheets and the promise of a printed book, yet the reaction was arguably more intense because the 1820s lacked any infrastructure for rapid verification or debunking. A rumor could travel the length of the Erie Canal in days and metastasize across hundreds of villages before anyone could mount an effective counter-narrative. In the digital age, the speed is greater, but so is the ability to challenge claims in real time. Paradoxically, that very speed often deepens polarization rather than resolving it. Every document dump generates its own counter-dumps, fact-checks, counter-fact-checks, and meta-debates about who is fact-checking the fact-checkers. The psychology of martyrdom helps explain why the Morgan story refuses to fade. In democratic societies, martyrdom functions differently than in theocratic or authoritarian ones. There is no official canonization process, no state-recognized blood of witnesses. Instead, martyrdom emerges through public narrative and popular acclamation. A figure becomes a martyr when enough people decide that his suffering or disappearance was caused by illegitimate power defending itself against legitimate criticism. Once that consensus forms, the martyr's cause is insulated from ordinary political cost-benefit analysis. Questioning the martyr's character becomes an attack on the cause itself. Doubting the martyrdom becomes proof of complicity. Morgan fits this pattern almost perfectly. He was not especially virtuous by conventional standards. Contemporary accounts describe him as impecunious, occasionally intemperate, opportunistic. Yet these flaws only strengthen the martyr narrative. A perfect saint might have been dismissed as unrealistic. An imperfect man who nonetheless paid the ultimate price for truth seemed more authentic. Lucinda's public grieving, the empty grave, the monument inscription, all these elements reinforce the story that an ordinary citizen had been destroyed by an extraordinary conspiracy. The very lack of a body became evidence of the conspiracy's power. They were so ruthless, so efficient, that they could make a man vanish without trace. This dynamic repeats in modern martyrdoms. The slain civil rights workers in Mississippi, 1964, the Kent State students, 1970, the January 6 defendants lionized by one political faction, the Black Lives Matter protesters killed during 2020 demonstrations. Each case produces competing martyr narratives because each side believes the other side's power structure is illegitimate. The Morgan precedent shows how early this pattern entered American public life. Long before mass media or social networks, a single disappearance could generate enough symbolic capital to sustain a political movement for a decade. Why then does a relatively minor event in a single region of one state still resonate so powerfully in the digital age? First, because it is unsolved. In an era when most historical mysteries are eventually clarified by DNA, satellite imagery, declassified files, or big data analysis, the Morgan case remains genuinely open. No amount of crowdsourcing, no ground-penetrating radar sweep of Fort Niagara, no mitochondrial DNA match has closed the file. That rarity alone makes it magnetic to anyone who loves puzzles. Second, because it is small-scale yet universal. The actors are not presidents or generals, but a bricklayer, a newspaper printer, a few dozen merchants and farmers. The stakes were local, a village reputation, a printing contract, a lodge's honor, yet the questions they raised were existential. Can any group claim the right to secrets in a democracy? Who decides when secrecy becomes conspiracy? When is exposure justified and when is it betrayal? These are questions every generation must answer anew, and each generation finds in Morgan's story a mirror that reflects its own anxieties about power, loyalty, and truth. Third, because the digital age has made us hyper-aware of institutional capture and elite networks. When users on social platforms point to the cathedral, the blob, the deep state, or simply they are invoking the same suspicion that animated crowds in Batavia town meetings in 1827. The names have changed, Masons have largely exited the villain role, but the structure of the accusation remains, a hidden compact among the connected few that overrides the interests of the many. Morgan's fate serves as a kind of historical proof of concept. Yes, it has happened before. Yes, ordinary people once rose up and forced accountability. Yes, the powerful can be wounded by nothing more than printed words. Finally, the story endures because it is emotionally complete without being factually complete. There is betrayal, abduction, outrage, political uprising, fading hope, ambiguous closure, the 1841 bones, a monument, and 2 centuries of unanswered questions. It has all the elements of great drama except the final scene. That missing resolution keeps the narrative alive. We keep returning to it, retelling it, reinterpreting it, because we hope that one day the last page will be written, either by a new document surfacing in an Ontario attic or by some future technology that can read sediment layers in Lake Ontario and identify a 200-year-old skeleton still wearing a bricklayer's ring. Until then, the story functions as a permanent cautionary tale and an enduring promise. Caution, secrecy breeds suspicion, and suspicion can destroy even innocent associations. Promise, one determined individual armed with nothing but courage and ink can sometimes force the hidden world into the light. In the end, William Morgan may have lost his life, his family, his name, but he gained something rarer, immortality in the American imagination. Not as a flawless hero, but as the man who reminded a young republic that no oath should ever be stronger than the citizen's right to know, and that when such an oath is enforced by violence, the violence itself becomes the loudest possible confession of guilt. Let us now step as close as history allows to the night itself, those final, shadowed hours when a living man became a question mark. We cannot witness them directly. No one left a reliable eyewitness account that was ever made public. But we can reconstruct the most plausible sequences using the fragments that do survive. Witness statements given under oath, the known geography of western New York in 1826, the documented habits of the Erie Canal and Niagara frontier, the physical realities of moving and concealing a human body without modern machinery or refrigeration, and perhaps most tellingly, the recorded behavior and later words of the men who carried William Morgan away. Theory 1. Deliberate drowning in the Niagara River or Lake Ontario. Probability. Highest among murder scenarios, roughly 55-65% when all sources are weighed. This remains the dominant narrative in both popular memory and most anti-Masonic accounts written between 1827 and 1850. The outline is grimly straightforward. After being held for 2 or 3 days in the powder magazine at Fort Niagara, an underground stone chamber 20 feet square, damp, windowless, ventilated only by narrow air shafts, Morgan was removed under cover of darkness on the night of September 13 or the very early morning of September 14. He was placed in a small boat, most likely a skiff or bateau, common on the river at that time with 4 to 6 men. The boat was rowed out from the fort's landing into the current of the Niagara River where it empties into Lake Ontario. Somewhere in the wide, black water between Youngstown and the mouth of the river, perhaps a mile or 2 offshore, a heavy weight, a cannonball from the fort's old magazine, a blacksmith's anvil, a length of chain wrapped around limestone, was fastened to Morgan's ankles or waist. He was either already unconscious from a blow or strangulation, or still conscious and pleading. In either case, he was pushed over the gunwale. The splash would have been muffled by wind and waves. The body would sink rapidly in 30 to 40 feet of water near shore, deeper farther out. Weighted, it would remain on the bottom, prevented from surfacing by decomposition gases. Supporting evidence, multiple witnesses in 1827 trials testified to seeing a closed carriage arrive at Youngstown or Lewiston on the evening of September 12 or 13, with men matching descriptions of Whitney, Chesebro, and others disembarking near the river. A Fort Niagara sentry, whose name was suppressed in published accounts but appears in manuscript court notes, claimed under private questioning that he heard a boat put out after midnight and low voices arguing, but saw nothing more because of fog. John Whitney's 1842 deathbed statement, dictated while he was dying of consumption, explicitly describes a boat, a weight, and a body consigned to the water. Though late and self-serving, Whitney claimed he was not present at the final act. The details match independent testimony about the fort and river. The Niagara River below the falls moves at 4 to 6 miles per hour. Anything unweighted would have been carried into the lake quickly and likely washed ashore somewhere between 30 Mile Point and Sodus Bay within days or weeks. No such body was reported in September-October 1826, despite widespread publicity and rewards. Counter-evidence and difficulties. No confession from any boatman or final participant ever named the exact spot or described the disposal in detail during the trials. Lake Ontario is large and deep, average 283 feet, maximum 802 feet. A weighted body could remain submerged indefinitely unless snagged by a fisherman's net or washed into shallows during a rare winter upwelling. The absence of a corpse is not proof of drowning. Absence is the problem itself. Logistics. The route from Canandaigua Jail to Fort Niagara was approximately 110-120 miles by road and canal path. Contemporary accounts describe fresh horses at relay points, Pembroke, Clarence, Lockport, Cambria, suggesting a journey of 24-36 hours with minimal stops. The final leg, Youngstown to Fort Niagara, is only 4 miles but crosses contested ground near the international boundary. Moving a bound, vocal prisoner through settled farm country without attracting notice would have required either gagging or drugging. Whiskey and laudanum were both available and commonly used for such purposes in frontier abductions. Psychological profile of the perpetrators. The men were not professional assassins. They were lodge masters, merchants, farmers, solid citizens accustomed to giving orders but not to violence. Their initial plan almost certainly was intimidation and exile. Frighten Morgan into silence, transport him across the border, pay him to stay away. Only when he refused to cooperate, or when they feared he would return and publish anyway, did the decision shift to something final. Panic, not cold-blooded calculation, likely drove the last act. A group of respectable men suddenly realized they had committed a capital crime. The fastest way to erase evidence was water. Water leaves no footprints. Theory 2, payment and voluntary disappearance into Canada, probability. 20-30% in this scenario. Morgan was rowed across the Niagara to Queenston or Lewiston, Canadian side, given a purse of money, perhaps $500, $1,000, a small fortune then, provided with new clothes and papers, and instructed never to return to the United States. He may have lived under an assumed name in Upper Canada for years, perhaps remarrying or simply fading into frontier anonymity. Supporting evidence. Several sightings reported in 1827-1830 placed Morgan in Queenston, Niagara-on-the-Lake, and Hamilton. One affidavit, James Rawson, 1828, described seeing him pale and guarded near Queenston shortly after the abduction. The 1830 Toronto letter, I live, forgive them, W. Morgan, was almost certainly forged. Paper stock analysis shows manufacture post-1830, but it reflects a persistent hope among some anti-Masons that he had been bought off rather than killed. Masonic sources after 1830 occasionally leaked rumors that the man was compensated and sent away, though never with proof. Whitney's 1842 statement claimed Morgan was taken to Canada and paid, though he then contradicted himself by saying the boat returned empty. Counter-evidence. Lucinda Morgan never received money or communication after September 1826. If her husband had been paid and safe, he almost certainly would have sent word or funds to support his wife and children. Morgan was not a man known for silent obedience. He had already rejected cash offers in Batavia to abandon the book. Why accept exile after abduction? No credible trace of him appears in Canadian records under his name or obvious aliases. Logistics crossing the Niagara in 1826 was not difficult. Ferries ran regularly, and small boats could make the trip in 20 minutes. Hiding a man in Upper Canada was easy. The province was sparsely settled, immigration poorly documented, and American fugitives common after debt defaults or minor crimes. Psychological fit. This theory requires the conspirators to trust Morgan's silence after betrayal and abduction, an enormous risk. It also requires Morgan to abandon his wife, children, reputation, and unfinished book for a life in hiding. Neither side's character strongly supports such mutual trust. Theory 3. Accidental death during transport or confinement, followed by hurried disposal. Probability 10–15%. Morgan dies unintentionally, suffocation from gag, heart failure from terror and restraint. Blow to the head meant only to stun, or illness in the damp magazine, and the men panic. They dispose of the body the same way they would have in the deliberate murder scenario. Supporting evidence. No participant ever boasted of the act or showed remorse in a way that suggested premeditated murder. Their later behavior, moving away, changing names, silence, suggests shame more than pride. The short sentences, 1 to 3 years, and light charges, kidnapping, not murder, may reflect jury's belief that no intent to kill existed. Counter-evidence. The elaborate transport to Fort Niagara suggests planning beyond a simple beating. Holding a prisoner for days implies intent to interrogate or pressure, not immediate death. Theory 4. Morgan escaped or was released and lived anonymously. Probability 5%. He overpowered a guard, slipped away in Canada, or was quietly released when the conspirators realized the political firestorm they had ignited. Supporting evidence. None credible. Contradicted by every participant's later life, guilt, relocation, silence. Theory 5. The entire disappearance was staged by Morgan himself with Masonic cooperation. Probability near 0. He took the money, faked abduction, and vanished to escape debts or start fresh. Supporting evidence. None beyond early Masonic rumors. Completely contradicted by Lucinda's behavior and the physical evidence of the abduction, witnesses, carriage, jail release. Of all scenarios, deliberate drowning remains the most consistent with the known timeline, geography, and human behavior under pressure. The Niagara frontier in 1826 offered the perfect disposal site. Fast current, great depth nearby, international boundary to confuse searches, frequent fog to hide boats. A weighted body in 40 to 80 feet of water near the mouth had virtually no chance of surfacing in recognizable condition before spring thaws and fish reduced it to bone. Yet even this most likely theory leaves gaps. No one has ever produced a confession naming the exact men in the boat or the precise method of weighting. The absence of such detail after 2 centuries suggests either perfect silence or no murder at all, yet the latter strains credulity given the weight of circumstantial evidence. The men who took Morgan were not monsters. They were husbands, fathers, churchgoers who believed they were protecting an ancient brotherhood from ruin. Their psychology was that of men who start with a bad decision, false arrest, and slide incrementally into worse ones, transport, confinement, final violence, because each step seems less terrible than turning back and facing exposure. Cognitive dissonance, groupthink, and fear of collective punishment did the rest. Once blood or panic entered the equation, retreat became impossible. We will never know the precise words spoken in that boat or the last look on Morgan's face. But we know the water was cold, the night moonless, the current relentless, and we know that whatever happened there, it was meant to be final, and instead became the beginning of something far larger than any of them could imagine. We have followed the trail as far as the surviving evidence will take us, through carriage ruts along the Erie Canal, through the dank powder magazine at Fort Niagara, through moonless water and conflicting whispers, and still the final frame remains out of focus. No skeleton has been dredged from the silt of Lake Ontario bearing Morgan's initials carved into a pocket watch. No yellowed letter has surfaced in a Canadian archive confessing, "I could not kill him, so I let him go." No DNA match has linked a 19th century bone fragment to Virginia cousins still living in Culpeper County. The mystery endures not because historians have failed to search hard enough, but because the event was designed, whether by intent or panic, to erase itself. And in that very erasure lies perhaps the deepest lesson the Morgan affair has left for American history. Unresolved mysteries are rare in the modern historical record. Most major crimes, scandals, and disappearances of the 19th and 20th centuries have, over time, yielded to forensic science, declassified documents, leaked memoirs, or sheer persistence of researchers. The fate of the princes in the Tower, the identity of Jack the Ripper, the precise movements of Amelia Earhart, even the authorship of Shakespeare's plays, all have accumulated enough new data over decades that the range of plausible answers has narrowed, even if it has not closed entirely. Yet William Morgan's disappearance belongs to a much smaller class, events whose central fact, life or death, murder or escape, is structurally resistant to closure. The absence of a body is not incidental, it is constitutive. Without remains, without a grave that can be exhumed and tested, without a signed confession that can be forensically authenticated, the case remains in permanent suspension. That suspension is its greatest historical gift, because it cannot be definitively solved, it cannot be safely filed away. It refuses the comfort of case closed. Every generation is therefore compelled to reopen the file to ask again, who has the right to keep secrets? When does a private brotherhood become a public threat? How much opacity can a transparent society tolerate before suspicion becomes paranoia? These are not questions that admit of one-time answers. They are perennial. By leaving them embodied in a single, vivid, maddeningly incomplete story, the Morgan affair functions as a kind of historical koan, a puzzle meant not to be solved, but to keep the mind awake. The anti-Masonic impulse that Morgan unwittingly unleashed was, in its moment, both necessary and excessive. Necessary because it forced a reckoning with the reality that secret oaths and hidden networks had embedded themselves deep within the machinery of American governance. Sheriffs, judges, jurors, newspaper publishers, even governors wearing the same symbolic apron. Excessive because it quickly outgrew its original grievance and became a blanket condemnation of any form of associational secrecy, including those in temperance societies, early labor unions, religious orders that posed no threat to Republican values. The movement burned bright and fast, consuming itself by the late 1830s as economic depression, abolitionist fervor, and sectional strife crowded it off the stage. Yet its embers never quite died. They smoldered on in the platforms of later third parties, in the rhetoric of every populist insurgency that has accused elites of operating behind closed doors, in the instinctive American demand that power explain itself. When 21st century citizens demand body cam footage from police, open records from city councils, algorithmic transparency from social media companies, or public audits of intelligence agencies, they are speaking, in however attenuated a form, the same language that Batavia farmers and Rochester printers spoke in 1827. The anti-Masonic party may have vanished, but the suspicion it crystallized has become part of the national immune system, a chronic, low-grade wariness toward any claim of "trust us, we know best." William Morgan himself remains the most enigmatic figure in the entire saga. He was no revolutionary, no philosopher, no martyr by temperament. He was a bricklayer who drank too much, a husband who struggled to pay rent, a man who saw an opportunity for profit and notoriety in exposing secrets others had sworn to keep. Yet in his stubborn refusal to be bought off or frightened off, he became something larger than his own intentions. He became proof that one individual, armed with nothing more than paper, ink, and defiance, can sometimes shift the balance of power, not by force of arms or eloquence of speech, but simply by refusing to stay silent. His legacy is therefore double-edged. On one side, he is the patron saint of whistleblowers, the man who demonstrated that revelation can be more powerful than conspiracy. On the other, he is a cautionary figure, the man whose act of exposure triggered a chain of events that ended in violence, ruined reputations, broken families, and a political movement that devoured its own children. The anti-Masons who lionized him in 1828 would later watch their cause be absorbed and diluted by larger parties. The Masons who hated him would see their order survive, adapt, and eventually regain respectability by becoming far more open about its existence, if not always its rituals. Everyone lost something, no one won cleanly, and yet the culture as a whole gained something irreplaceable, a permanent reminder that secrecy and democracy exist in necessary tension. A society without any private spaces, without families that close their doors, without friendships that share confidences, without voluntary associations that set their own rules would be intolerable. A society in which any group can claim immunity from scrutiny simply by swearing oaths and enforcing silence would be unfree. The trick is finding the boundary between legitimate privacy and illegitimate concealment. That boundary is never fixed, it must be renegotiated constantly. Morgan's disappearance marks one of the moments when Americans were forced to redraw the line. In the 21st century, that renegotiation has become exponentially more complicated. Digital encryption allows private communication at a scale unimaginable in 1826, yet the same technologies enable mass surveillance that makes Masonic secrecy look quaint. Social media platforms promise community while harvesting data in ways no 19th century lodge could dream of. Governments classify trillions of pages while leaking selectively to shape narratives. Whistleblowers can release gigabytes in seconds, yet often find themselves prosecuted more aggressively than the secrets they exposed were ever protected. Citizens are simultaneously more connected and more suspicious than at any previous moment in history. Against this backdrop, the Morgan story reads less like ancient history and more like a warning from the past to the present. It reminds us that when people lose faith in the good faith of institutions, whether fraternal orders, political parties, corporations, or intelligence agencies, they will reach for the most powerful tool available, exposure. Sometimes that tool produces reform, sometimes it produces only chaos, often it produces both at once. The unresolved nature of Morgan's fate may therefore be the most honest ending possible. A tidy resolution, a confirmed grave, a signed confession, a discovered letter would allow us to close the book and say, "This is what happened, lesson learned." An open wound keeps the lesson alive. It forces each generation to confront the same uncomfortable questions. How much secrecy is too much? Who decides? What happens when the decision is enforced by violence or coercion? And most hauntingly, what if the truth is never fully recoverable? Perhaps that is the ultimate meaning of the Morgan affair in American history. It is not a story about a bricklayer who vanished in 1826. It is a story about a republic that learned painfully, imperfectly, and incompletely that the price of self-government includes eternal vigilance not only against external enemies, but against the very human impulse to hide, to bind, to exclude, to punish those who would open the door and let in the light. 2 centuries later, the monument in Batavia Cemetery still stands, the inscription as blunt and unapologetic as it was in 1842, sacred to the memory of W.M. Morgan, abducted and murdered by Masons for revealing their secrets. Most passers-by no longer pause. The cars on Harvester Avenue hum past without slowing. Children on bicycles circle the paths, laughing at something on their phones. Yet the stone continues its quiet work. It does not demand belief. It does not require agreement. It simply refuses to let the question die. And somewhere, perhaps in the cold silt of Lake Ontario, perhaps in an unmarked grave near Hamilton, perhaps only in the stubborn memory of a nation that still argues about power and truth, the man who once laid bricks in Batavia keeps asking the same thing he asked on that September night in 1826. Why must some things remain hidden? The answer, after all this time, is still not final. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be.